Well, as Brazil faces another 3 weeks of uncertainty, incumbent Jair Bolsonaro says he would show the people that the change they were looking for would mean Brazil ending up like Venezuela.
We beat the lie today, which was Datafolha, market research company, polls, giving 51% to 30% and a few. We beat the lie. A part of the population has the feeling that their lives are not the same as they were before the pandemic, but a little bit worse, and the tendency is to look for the one responsible for that, and the responsible person is always the chief executive. But now, in this second round, we are going to show them that the change they are seeking, in my opinion, will be for the worse. I worry about Brazil losing its freedom, Brazil walking with the left in the ways of Venezuela, Argentina, Colombia, and also of Chile and Nicaragua. That is my concern.
Nicaragua, essa é a preocupação.
Jair Bolsonaro. Well, for more, we can join Arise correspondent Laurie Laird, who's been monitoring developments from London. Good to see you, Laurie. Good evening. Is this result a surprise to you?
Absolute shocker, Charles. Look, Jair Bolsonaro did not win, but the fact that he ran Lula da Silva within 5 percentage points is utterly shocking. The 42% of the vote went to Bolsonaro, 48% to da Silva. Polling ahead of the vote had the best polls for Bolsonaro had him in the high 30s. So this is so different than what the polls predicted. One thing that seems to have happened is that the polling, the turnout, the result for the third and fourth place candidates, one is a centrist, one is slightly left of center, that totaled about 7% for those the third and fourth place. Most of that's less than the polls had predicted. Most of that support seems to have gone from the third and fourth place and gone straight to Bolsonaro. So it raises questions about when those third and fourth place candidates are not in the race in the runoff, will those votes, that 7% that voted for those two, will that flow directly to Bolsonaro, which would mean a very, very tight race in the runoff on the 30th of October.
Well, I mean, you understand that part of the world much better than we do. I mean, might we see Jair Bolsonaro back in the presidency? I mean, after the polls got it clearly wrong. I mean, or is it still more likely to be Lula in your assessment?
I think at this point, very, very difficult to predict because we simply don't know which way the votes will go for people who did not choose one of the first two candidates, which way those votes will go in the runoff. Now, neither of the third or fourth place candidates has endorsed anyone yet, and both of those candidates say that they will come up with an endorsement in the coming days. I think it's too early to rule out Bolsonaro at this point. Again, he ran so much tighter a race than anybody would have predicted.
And of course, as you mentioned there, this is an enormous show of strength from the right. I mean, not just from Bolsonaro, but the people they call the Bolsonaristas, who were also elected to Congress and as state governors.
Absolutely. Bolsonaro's allies did very well in state governorships, also did very, very well in the Senate. Of those 27 Senate seats that were up for grabs, 19 went to allies right of center and in some cases far right allies of Bolsonaro, which puts Brazil in a slightly, as we mentioned, a slightly different, or as Bolsonaro mentioned, slightly different place than other places in Latin America, where we're seeing much, much more of a surge of support for left-wing candidates. But I think what people are thinking about right now, both in Brazil and outside of the country, is what happens if this is a tight race? What happens if Bolsonaro loses in a tight race? He has said things along the lines of, only God can remove me from office. He has modeled himself after Donald Trump. So the question is, if he is defeated in that second round of voting, will he in fact leave office?
Well, yes, that's a very good question. And the other big question, of course, is about the accuracy of the polls. I mean, you know, the day before the elections, they were predicting a 14 percentage point gap between Lula and Bolsonaro. Lula obviously hoping to avoid a runoff, but vastly underestimating the support. And of course, the polls got it, you know, slightly wrong, not entirely, because he still, won, but slightly wrong, and now it goes to a runoff.
Absolutely. And the pollsters did get, and I'll even say this was more than slightly wrong. I mean, this really was a very big miss for the pollsters. And we've seen a lot of big misses for pollsters over the past decade or so, but this one really is rather grave. We haven't had any responses from the pollsters yet. Often the response that we do hear is people are shy. People don't want to tell pollsters that they in fact support Bolsonaro. They don't want to admit being associated with someone who's, Bolsonaro is very controversial. He is very divisive. So perhaps people didn't tell the truth to pollsters. But I think where things went wrong is in overestimating the support for the third and fourth place candidates. They were meant to do much, much better than they did. And it may be that people went to the polls and thought my preference, the guy who came in third or fourth, is not going to win, so I'm going to cast my vote elsewhere for somebody who might have a chance of winning this. So the polling seems to have gone very, very wrong in the kind of further down the ballot races.
And of course, there's 4 weeks to go before that runoff. We've heard a lot of ominous threats, fears of people taking a more violent approach, especially supporters of Jair Bolsonaro. One of them mentioning, or at least a number of them, talking about beautiful blood being spilled if Lula wins. How concerning is that?
Extremely concerning, Charles. Extremely concerning. This has been a very highly personal campaign. We've heard so little about policy in this campaign. Both of the candidates have campaigned on insulting the other one. We don't really know. We know that Bolsonaro tends to be much more conservative than Lula da Silva. We know that when da Silva was president, he left office in 2010, that he greatly expanded fiscal spending. That was very popular. He left office with a 90% approval rating. So the assumption is that he will open the floodgates again, that there will be a lot more fiscal spending, but we're not hearing any sort of policy on the campaign trail. All we are hearing is the two men trading insults. So if you look at it that way, the potential for things to get nasty very much exists.
Laurie, for the moment, thanks very much indeed. Our ICE correspondent Laurie Laird with her assessment of the outcome of the results from the Brazilian elections.